Okay, today we'll be talking about rhetorically effective sentences. Now, keep in mind as we go through these exercises that you are to imitate the structure of the examples, but not their content. The content is your contribution. So as we look through these examples, I'm going to give you a few instances of how I would imitate the structure without copying the content. So the first type or rhetorically effective sentence is the Anadiplosis sentence. Now, Anadiplosis, as you can see from the first example here, is an example of one word that concludes a clause being the same word that introduces the beginning of the next clause. So labor and care are rewarded with success. Okay, so that's A, success. And then what's the very first word of the next clause? Success. A, success produces confidence. That's B, right? So now we're going to, the very next clause is going to start with B, confidence, right? Confidence relaxes industry and negligence ruins the reputation which diligence has raised. This is a quote from Samuel Johnson. So Anadiplosis is concluding a clause with a word and that same word being used to begin the next clause. I give another example. So we have rich at the end of one clause, rich at the beginning of the next clause, married at the end of one clause, and then married at the beginning of the next clause. The final example that I give here is the laughter had to be gross or it would turn to sobs. And to sob would be to realize, and to realize would be to despair. And you can see how sobs ends one clause and begins the very next clause. Realize ends one clause and begins the very next one. So let me show you an example of how I would imitate this last example by Howard Griffin. And I put this together. So here I'm going to imitate the structure without imitating the content. I'm going to come up with my own creative content here. The teacher had to be tough or unearned grades would lead to lowered expectations. Now, I've ended with lowered expectations with my first clause. So lowered expectations has to begin the very next clause. So I say, and lowered expectations would lead to decreased effort. Okay, so I've ended with decreased effort, so I now have to begin with decreased effort with the next clause. And decreased effort would lead to a continued erosion of skills which their generation was already lacking. I've imitated the structure without imitating his content. I'm talking about something entirely different, but I'm using the same structure. I am using Anadiplosis. In using Anadiplosis, the reader understands the relationships between ideas, and you are able to convey that emotional impact of how one thing can easily lead to another much more effectively in the use of Anadiplosis. Okay, Polysyndeton is the next type of rhetorically effective sentence that I introduce, and what we have here is the use of a conjunction connecting multiple clauses. And we, instead of using commas or semicolons, we have conjunctions. So from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, she says, let the white folks have their money and power and segregation and sarcasm and big houses and schools and lawns like carpets and books and mostly let them have their whiteness, right? So notice how one feels the emotional impact of what she is saying because of the use of and throughout. Let me read it without the and you can see how you lose that emotional impact. Let the white folks have their money, power, segregation, sarcasm, big houses, schools, lawns like carpets, books, and mostly let them have. See how you lose the emotional impact there? When you have the and, we're emphasizing each item, and we're really putting some power behind each part of this statement. In the next example here by William F. Buckley, in years gone by, there were in every community men and women who spoke the language of duty and morality and loyalty and obligation. Each quality is emphasized through the use of and. If we didn't use and between each of these items and we used only commas, notice how it loses its emotional impact. Men and women who spoke the language of duty, morality, loyalty, and obligation. See, it's just a string of ideas. We're not really emphasizing any of them, but because we have duty and morality and loyalty and obligation, we are emphasizing that each one of these qualities is important, and we're emphasizing the need for each. Okay, the next example I give is anaphora. Anaphora is beginning each clause or phrase with the same word or words. Probably the most famous is Winston Churchill's, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender," right? So I love this quote for many reasons. One is that geographically, he's saying that we're never going to surrender no matter how far they succeed in taking the fight. Notice that they're going to begin fighting on the beaches, but then if they push past the beaches, then they'll continue to fight on the landing grounds. And if they push past the landing grounds, they're going to fight in the fields. And if they don't succeed in the fields, once they're in the streets of London, they'll continue to fight. And if they have to, they'll continue to fight once they're in the hills. So as the enemy invades further and further into England, we're going to continue to fight. And so geographically, he begins at the beaches and concludes in the hills. And the message is, we're going to never surrender. No matter how far the enemy advances, we will never surrender. And of course, we have this great example of anaphora. We shall fight, we shall fight, we shall fight, we shall fight at the beginning of each clause. This is a rather easy one to imitate, I would think. The other example of anaphora that I give you is from Martin Luther King Jr., but 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later, right? And so we have this phrase at the beginning of each of his sentences that he repeats. All of these are examples of parallel structure. They're just different variations of a form of parallel structure that each author is using. Notice the impact, the emotional impact of using parallel structure when we write. We can move an audience emotionally as we create sentences like these. Antimetabole is another example, and this is probably one that you're familiar with, although you probably didn't know the name. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. This is by John F. Kennedy. And of course, what we're doing here, what John F. Kennedy was doing here, is we are flipping, we are reversing the order of the first clause into the next clause. So we have ask not what your country, this is the first point we make, can do for you, second for you, and then we flip it in reverse order. Then we begin with you, number two, can ask what you can do for your country, ending with one. So notice the flip from country doing for you, you can do for your country. So we flip syntactically. What we're doing is we're reversing the grammatical structure of the first clause in the second clause. We have here the same thing going on with this wonderful quote by Samuel Johnson. It ought to be the first endeavor of a writer to distinguish that which is established because it is right from that which is right only because it is established. Beautiful quote, and beautiful sentiment. So we have established because it is right, and then we have right because it is established. We're reversing the order. When the going gets tough, the tough get going, Joseph P. Kennedy. So again, going, tough, tough, going. So we've reversed the order. And then lastly, another anonymous quote here. They don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Again, we got this wonderful care, how much you know. And we flip the order, know how much you care. If I were to imitate one of these, I might imitate this last one and say something like this. They won't pass the ball to you until you pass the ball to them, okay? I'm using my own content. I'm being creative here, but I am imitating the structure. So I have they to you, and then you to them. You know, I'm not going to say you to they. That, of course, would be grammatically incorrect, but the Antimetabole remains in this example. So this might give you some ideas of what you might be able to do as you complete this assignment. And lastly, epistrophe. This is when we have the word or phrase repeated at the end of each clause. So here we have another one by John F. Kennedy. For no government is better than the men who compose it, and I want the best, and we need the best, and we deserve the best. So we have the best, the best, the best. This is from the movie The Breakfast Club, a 1985 film. Don't you ever talk about my friends. You don't know any of my friends. You don't look at any of my friends. And you certainly wouldn't condescend to speak to any of my friends, right? I think this is another one that's rather easy to imitate. You're repeating the same word or phrase at the end of clauses. So good luck. I think you can do this, and I look forward to seeing the examples that you provide.